Thanks so much, Chris. I really appreciate your introduction. Welcome, everyone. It's good to see some familiar faces. So, next slide, please, Chris. We have some announcements to start off this webinar. So, just a couple of quick announcements today. Thank you so much to everyone who submitted their application package for POY this year. Um, Myself, Betsy, Kate, and Danny are currently in the process of reviewing those application packages. Unfortunately, at this time, we don't have an estimated date that you will hear about the status of your application, but please stay tuned and we will let you know as soon as we are able. Um, One other announcement for today, for planning on submitting for plant certification for 2024, please submit your final application package by this Friday, December 13th. Those who have intended to apply for plant certification this year should have already notified Danny at certification at energystar.gov. But the final deadline for application packages for plant certification this year is this Friday, December 13th. That is the last day that we will be accepting those applications. Next slide, please, Chris. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ron Stella and Spiro Zinos from the Boeing Company. They're members of the Global Enterprise Sustainability Team to talk through how cap and trade associations are affecting Boeing's operations in Washington State specifically. So Ron and Spiros, take it away.
Yeah, thank you. Spiro, do you want to say a few quick words?
Sure. I'm really excited for the turnout today, and hopefully we can field some of your questions. I'm going to apologize in advance. I've got a little voice thing going on here, so Ron's going to run the presentation for it. But just to give you a little background, I've been with the company for about 3 decades. Ron and I are both in the global enterprise sustainability team, and I'm more focused on the energy conservation, where Ron is our subject matter expert on the CCA items. So, Ron, go ahead.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, about a year and a half with the Boeing Company, and like Spiro said, we're on the Enterprise Sustainability Group, and I'm focused a lot on energy policy and the Climate Commitment Act in Washington State. It's one of my focal areas. So with that, I'll try to make a slightly boring but very complicated topic a little fun, and we'll kind of dive into what we're doing here at the Boeing Company in Washington State. So I'm going to talk today about what is a cap and trade or a cap invest system. And cap and trade, it's more well known. It started in California, but cap invest is what they call it in Washington State. But both terms are pretty synonymous. So we're going to talk about where it exists, why you should be aware, some of the regulations necessitating energy efficiency and decarbonization for the Boeing Company, especially at the Washington sites. And we're going to deep dive into Washington's Climate Commitment Act. You'll hear me say CCA. That refers to the Washington State Climate Commitment Act and their overall subsequent cap and invest program. A lot of what I do is carbon position forecasting, believe it or not. It is quite tedious and complicated, but we'll get into a little bit of that. I removed a lot of slides that go into some of the details. There's just too much detail, but surprisingly, it's a job, carbon position forecasting. And then we'll get into some more interesting things about what we're doing around decarbonization strategies and some examples at our Auburn site and what we think are appropriate next steps. So I want to talk about what a cap and trade or cap and invest system program is. I think of it as a stock exchange. We have a whole platform in Washington State where we monitor our carbon allowances, and it's almost like stock certificates. But essentially, cap and invest program limits GHG emissions, and that cap at the state level is reduced over time. And it's encouraging businesses like ours to basically make it more expensive for us to emit greenhouse gases. So it entices us financially to incentivize decarbonization and energy efficiency. Think about it like this: a carbon allowance. You hear me talk about carbon allowances often, and allowances are a permit. It's a permit to emit 1 metric ton of greenhouse gas. So we need to have a total number of allowances equal to our greenhouse gas emittance for the year on hand in basically our bank account where we hold our carbon allowances. One thing that it does, like I said, it's a stock exchange. It's almost like a free market system where it incentivizes us to reduce our carbon footprint, implement energy efficiency measures, because these allowances reduced over time and become more expensive. States use these proceeds for other clean energy projects throughout the state or other environmental justice initiatives, including like commuting transportation. So that's the basics of a cap invest, and think of it like a carbon market, just like a stock exchange. I'd like to kind of ask a few questions, not really just food for thought. Where does your company have large operations? Something to think about. What states? Do you operate significant presence in the Northwest, the Northeast, the European Union? And it's possible to think about it like this: when will your state adopt a cap and invest system? Not do you have one? Because we're seeing more and more adoption of these type of limits on greenhouse gases that affect large companies. All right, where else is it and why you should be aware? Well, this started in the United States with California. Again, it's capped for large emitters and businesses for 25,000 metric tons of CO2e. That came across almost 11 years ago. Washington State, while we do have significant presence, Boeing Company in California, back to California, we're not over the cap. So we're aware of it. We have policy around it and internal guidance, but we're not over the cap, so we're not as invested in it with the details surrounding it. Washington State is a total different animal because we are over the cap of 25,000 metric tons at 2 out of our dozen or so sites there in Washington State. And yeah, kind of one error here in Oregon. It just passed in 2024 and it goes into effect next year in 2025. So Oregon also has a cap at 15,000 metric tons, which is a pretty low bar. And that just got passed around Thanksgiving time this year and goes into effect next year. Where else should we be on the lookout? Well, we're closely monitoring this regional greenhouse gas initiative. Basically, the Northeast states have something in place since 2009. Their cap is focused on power plants, energy producers. However, there are always ongoing discussions of bringing that cap to large emitters like ours, like manufacturers in those states. So it's something that they already have a large framework there, but we need to keep an eye on it. And overseas in EU, UK, Quebec, certainly cap and trade, cap and invest systems, caps on greenhouse gas emissions is in effect. So something to really be aware of. All right, thank you. I won't get into all the different types of emissions because it does vary of what is a covered emission. I just saw that comment about what emissions. For Washington State, though, it's 99.5% natural gas. So I'll kind of go into that a little bit more, but as we look at approaching compliance in Washington State, we're really talking about internally natural gas. Some fuel oil is included, but it's really negligible, and it's really CCA, Climate Commitment Act of Washington State, is focused on natural gas reduction. And that kind of goes into a little bit of what's here and what's kind of layered on for us. Started with the Department of Commerce with the Clean Energy Transformation Act, CETA. And really in the state of Washington, this is mandating 100% clean energy by 2045. There are many benchmarks there, but all GHG is supposed to be removed from electric utilities by 2045. So considering that the electric up in Washington State should be clean, that's why there is a big focus on natural gas now. So that happened a number of years ago. Kind of simultaneously, we have the Building Emissions Performance Standard and the Clean Building Act in Washington State. And this is really getting buildings to be net zero by certain dates and implementing energy use intensity targets based on building types. That kind of came on board here over the last few years. We have the first deadline coming up next year, June 2026, and Seattle, their program is in October of 2027 for one of the first benchmarking reporting dates. So these three acts layered on until what we're really talking about today is the Climate Commitment Act, run by the State Department of Ecology in the state of Washington. So this is the legislation that has set that emissions cap at 25,000 metric tons. If you're over that cap, you have to have allowances or permits to emit over that cap. The goal of it is to reduce greenhouse gas reduction by 95% from 1990 levels by 2050. So incredibly aggressive. Again, that's 95% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050 from 1990 levels. It's intended to reduce the reliance on natural gas and really shift and electrify a lot of different industries and businesses in the state, because the state is well advanced with CETA to have a greenhouse gas emissions-free electricity. So they kind of all layered on top of each other. They started with electricity, of greenhouse gas free electricity, targeted buildings for greenhouse gas reduction and decarbonization and energy efficiency, and finally put a cap on emissions in the state. And that's kind of why I focused on these four major regulations in the state of Washington that are really prompting us and forcing us to decarbonize and implement energy efficiency measures, even above and beyond what we've wanted to do as just a good corporate culture. So what is it? And I talked about this, so I'll just get a little bit more in depth about it. The allowances on the market, on the stock exchange, shrink over time. So supply and demand is real. As supply goes down, the price of the carbon allowances go up that companies need to purchase to be over that cap. So it really incentivizes us to do two things. That's kind of why I included this image on the left. We're going to compete for a shrinking supply of allowances that are going to cost us more money over time to be over that cap. And we're going to take steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and implement energy efficiency measures for a combination of both to comply as best we can with makes the most fiscal sense for us and the right thing to do according to our corporate policies. So the program Washington State goes up. It goes to funding programs for children, for public transportation, electric vehicle network in the state as well. So the money does go to be reinvested in other clean energy transformation projects, which is nice. So basically setting the stage again, I like this image because it really shows the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions over time due to this cap. So again, that's 95% reduction in GHGs in the state by 2050. And it applies, the Cap and Invest program that I talked about is enacted by the CCA legislation, applies to businesses with CO2e emissions from natural gas over 25,000 metric tons a year. So it really focuses on large emitters in the state of Washington, but does create reduction pathways for acknowledged high energy intensive businesses. And I'll get into what a EITE is shortly here. But if you can think about making aircraft, I learned a lot about even some of the processes we use in the state of Washington, how high energy intensive it is to do. We're using a lot of natural gas for some of these processes to do composites and other issues with making aircraft in the state. So we are part of a group called an emissions intensive trade exposed industry. There are about 15 different industries that they're the graphic on the left that the state acknowledges as very high and difficult industries to reduce energy and decarbonize. So we face unique challenges, especially in the early years of the Cap Invest system. Our manufacturing facilities are high energy and do emit greenhouse gases. And basically there's national competition and global competition for our products. Some of the status of the EITE, again, that's emissions intensive and trade exposed. It's intended to protect jobs in the state and not have carbon leakage. About 40 different businesses qualify in the state, like producers of paper, semiconductors, and aircraft manufacturers. what does that mean and why do we care? Well, the EIT status affords us no cost allowances, but they're declining. So that means for the first compliance period, 2023 to 2026, the state is giving us 100% of our 5-year baseline in no cost allowances. And then each compliance period, that no cost allowance reduces over 3% each 4-year compliance period. So this affects 2 of our major sites out of the almost more than a dozen sites that we have in Washington State. Everett and Auburn are over that 25,000 metric ton GHG cap. Okay, we're still required to reduce greenhouse gas and help the state achieve its net zero goal by 2050. We just have a longer lead time to decarbonize. And I guess I'll make a aircraft reference. The glide slope is a more shallow glide slope. And I'd like to show this slide throughout our company to really show them. The blue is what every business entity in the state of Washington is required to reduce. And those that have been designated by the state as the energy-intensive trade-exposed industries are the orange line. Our glide slope still has to decline. We still have to, decline our energy use and reduce our greenhouse gas. However, we have a more shallow slope to do that, and just recognizing that it's quite difficult to immediately implement some of these decarbonization measures that we'll need to do to get in alignment with this policy here. So again, we get 100% of our baseline no cost allowances and 97% in the following compliance period, followed by another 3% reduction, 94%. And then we're evaluating what's going to happen after that 2034. So the year 2035 is unknown about no cost allowances. So part of my job is figuring out how many allowances we need to have on hand and what type of funding do we need to continue to purchase allowances while we're implementing decarbonization measures. I mentioned briefly, but it was kind of a complicated process around governance and procedures internally about how to hold and store and track these carbon instruments, carbon allowances. So the state has like an online marketplace platform that we have to hold our allowances in. And then prior to November 1st each year, we transfer those allowances from the holding account to a compliance account, and the state, through ecology, the Department of Ecology, will retire those allowances on our behalf based on audited greenhouse gas inventory. I think what we noticed with this program, how important it was to have very strong greenhouse gas emissions data and tracking and inventory in order to do this. We had a very robust system, and then every year we take those GHG inventory, all the data, and it has to be independently third-party audited, and we submit the audit in August for the previous year, and November we basically retire those allowances from the previous year. Technically, it's the minimum is 30% of the previous year's compliance obligation, and then we true up at the end of the compliance period of 2027 for the remaining 70% of those allowances. So we basically track the forecast of how many extra allowances we may need to purchase by being potentially over our baseline. And there's a potential to even hold on to allowances as we come in under our baseline. So it really does incentivize us to not have to use all those allowances, because like I mentioned, those allowances increase in value over time. So it is really very expensive for us to buy those in the out years, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But we're really able to show through some of the forecasting simulations what happens if we come under our baseline by a certain percentage each year. Those allowances reside in our bank account and really do increase in value over time, just like the stock market hopefully does for everyone. So we're really, part of our job is to show kind of the value of these allowances and compare it to capital investment to incentivize even further capital investments. So some of the other issues we're tracking with this cap and invest system is what the price is. I kind of alluded to it. It goes up linearly, but there's initiatives underway for the Department of Ecology in Washington State to join the larger market of Quebec and California, making an even bigger carbon market. And I almost think of it as like the New York Stock Exchange joining with the NASDAQ or the Amex years ago. So this is there's a potential for prices to stay even higher if the ecology doesn't join Quebec and California, or if they merge. We're anticipating possibly some lower prices, which would help the market really stabilize. So something that we track, the potential for linkage with the other state and Canada. We're running a lot of different scenarios, and I kind of have a bunch of like charts and tables about this extending all the way to 2050. But for the purposes here, really just tried to show something very generic and basic. But we're evaluating our team 4 different scenarios that we think are very plausible. And we have one scenario that starts in, you can't really tell here, but around that 2030 time frame, we're really start spending in the millions, and then it goes up. So there's a scenario that we think is very plausible, where if we're required to continue on that orange trajectory of meeting the 2050 target, year 2050 target of 95%, without additional no-cost allowances. This is a several $100 million program for those 2 sites. So, more towards upwards of $400 million. This would cost us over the life of this program. So when we talk about hundreds of millions of dollars, it's very expensive. It probably scares a lot of different people. However, it gives us an ability to talk about the investment in energy efficiency projects. If a boiler is 20 million, standing alone, it talks about, it seems like a lot when we're talking about a $20 million boiler project. But when we talk about the hundreds of million dollars that this program is likely to cost us by 2050, when that boiler is still in service, it makes our conversations about capital investment a little bit easier, and it definitely has more weight. So what do we do? Often what we do here, our strategy is to study different plants and really understand where the natural gas is used and how it's used. So we've commissioned, as an example of an energy efficiency study that we kicked off at Auburn site. That study really gives us an understanding of how and when we use our natural gas to begin, again, strategizing about capital investment. We have things ongoing through this project. We're strategizing about the allowances, the forecast price of carbon, but we're also strategizing about how to reduce natural gas, primarily at these 2 sites, but all throughout our organization, the enterprise. But we're really focused right now today, especially on these 2 sites that are over this cap. So this study has really told us a few things. 47% of our natural gas use is just normal process equipment, but about 53% of it is weather related for heat, air exchanges, and things like that. So you'll see a lot, like 53%. I almost want to think it's like out of our control, and we're dependent on the weather. It also kind of just helps us emphasize, like, on those systems that control heating and air handling, why it's so efficient, better for us to target those systems as well. Typically, we'll take a study about our natural gas and commission an investment grade audit of our manufacturing sites. So an investment grade audit is a comprehensive evaluation of all the commercial buildings' energy use, operations, and really the aim of it is to identify inefficiencies and opportunity for energy savings at our sites. So this is just an example of items that were discovered that really could reduce CO2e and reduce natural gas, and we'll just kind of target those systems. Oftentimes we try to take an IGA, the investment grade audit, and turn it into an energy performance contract with an energy service company. Essentially, they will help with the outlay of capital investment for a longer term sharing of that, the dollar cost, the savings over a longer period of time. So we have a guaranteed savings, they have a guaranteed savings. The scope of work for the capital investment is a contract, and it enables us to do creative financing to get some of these large-scale capital investment projects underway and share in the energy saving costs over time with the ESCO, the energy service company. Oftentimes, we'll get a study, and this one indicated a lot of different scenarios for us to consider. So we go through an evaluation with our site leadership, our engineers working at the factory level, and discuss really what pathways do we want to pursue, and oftentimes it's a little bit of everything we're trying to pursue to reduce emissions and save energy at these sites. So we were looking at the purchasing of allowances, the pros and cons essentially with that, and kind of like what I showed earlier, even though the study kind of outlaid pros and cons, to comply with CCA, the Climate Commitment Act, it really has to do a combination of both. We're going to have to purchase allowances, and we're going to have to decarbonize and implement energy efficiency measures. So we've evaluated things about purchasing allowances, purchasing renewable natural gas. One of the key points this study in particular made is the option or the point to try to electrify our boiler systems. Now, there are limited use cases. You see that on one of the disadvantages here. It's very capital intensive. There are some complicated operational procedures, but there's a huge reduction in emissions if we start transitioning some of these boiler systems from natural gas. And we have some boilers, just like probably you all, that we're lucky these boilers last for 50 years, but a 50-year-old boiler is not very efficient. So, we go through an exercise of determining, replacement boilers. Is just a high efficiency, a new boiler with natural gas good enough? And while we've looked at that, there is a pathway where we could get under that 25,000 metric ton emissions cap if we were to electrify some of the boilers. So we're really, that is an interesting pathway for us to get out of having to purchase allowances and be under that emissions cap. A site like Auburn, we think there's potential to get us eventually under that cap, but Everett is going to take decades of work to reduce those emissions if that's even possible. So we're focusing on energy efficiency across the board at our sites, but really this identification of systems like electric boilers is something that we're targeting at our Auburn site to get below that cap. And then as well as a number of like deep carbonization projects like HVAC equipment, we've identified a lot of different pieces of equipment that can be more energy efficient or transition to electric. And really, like I mentioned, the push within the state is to really electrify, because they have that very strong language and regulation on the books called CETA for 100% greenhouse gas emissions-free electricity by 2045. So all these things continue to roll up and point us towards electricity and electrifying our major systems. And of course, when we do that, we have to coordinate with our utility to partner to achieve that electrification. And we also have to time these projects, not even coordinate with them, but we have to really partner with our utilities up in the Pacific Northwest where hopefully they're bringing on additional clean energy capacity at the same time we're pushing to electrify and expand at our sites. Right now, it's an interesting system up in Frederickson, Kent, and Renton and Auburn. Those 4 sites are limited to 53 megawatts. We have a contract that's limiting our max capacity to 53 megawatts of electricity. So while the state is obviously pushing us to get rid of natural gas, push towards electrification, our utility has us capped. So what we've done is we just commissioned a study in partnership with our utility to evaluate enhanced and upgraded transmission. And if a system is needed for more transmission and more lines, we'd probably enter into a facility study agreement that really decides on and declares the costs of that infrastructure upgrade and gets into the details of what's needed. So, yeah, it gets complicated because we're tracking carbon position and how many allowances we have on hand versus what our projected emittance is for the year. We're implementing studies on how we're using the natural gas and what we could do to reduce it. And then as we look for those studies that are really identifying electrification as the pathway that would help us make the most major primary reduction in greenhouse gases, we're at capacity there. And so it's really needed that we closely work, on a quarterly basis, monthly basis with our utility to make sure they understand what we need to do at our manufacturing sites so they can make their long-range plans to implement enhanced capacity of electricity at the sites. Substations and things like that, and transmission lines. They used to take just 3 to 5 years, and now I feel like anytime we're talking about that, it's like 5 to 8 or a decade in case of some of this equipment and transmission lines. So it's really imperative. The lesson learned is to kind of talk and partner with your utility for electrification capacity. So going through some of the next steps. There are a lot of deadlines with cap and invest types of systems. I talked about that annual deadline of August for reporting of third-party verified greenhouse gas inventories. There's transfer of allowances, purchase of offsets that all have to happen on a lot of scheduled deadlines throughout the year. So we just met our first deadline, which was that November 1st was the first time we've retired any carbon allowances in the state. And that was a big deal for our company, a company our size. These allowances had a dollar value worth, several millions of dollars. So it was just a bit of a procedure to transfer these allowances and retire them on behalf of the Boeing Company. What really stuck out with me is that we had really good procedures and governance of this process that we set up in the beginning. So that was really important to have all those players that we have quarterly meetings where we talk about our emissions at the sites, where we are with the actual emissions versus the cap, and how that cap matches up with the available compliance carbon instruments and allowances and offsets that we have in our account. So we really also continue to strategize and optimize our carbon position strategy. So, what I mean by that is not only our forecast that we're closely tracking versus used GHG emissions versus forecasted versus what we actually have for allowances, matching up with our partners at the sites to say, okay, you're contemplating installing a $20 million electric boiler at one of your sites. Well, let me forecast you the amount of allowances that we would save over time if we were able to implement this energy efficiency project. And those allowances are also worth several millions of dollars. So having some of these allowances in the bank helps me and helps us make an argument for future funding of capital investment. And because these allowances can be sold on the open market if we don't need them, if we reduce below the cap and implement all these energy efficiency measures that are identified, we could save these allowances and sell them if we so wish, or use them at another site affected like Everett. So we're constantly balancing the purchase of allowances with capital investment. All options are still on the table. One of my bosses was reviewing this, and she made a good point of making sure we convey it's an all hands approach, an all pathways approach, that we still need to evaluate everything and make sure all options are on the table. And we're going to continue to drive emissions lower at the company. And really, it's a combination of both. I go back to that graphic on the bottom right side to comply with cap and invest type of program like we have in Washington State, that's in California, that's in Oregon. It's really a combination of both, taking steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, implementing energy efficiency projects, and also purchasing allowances that get more and more expensive over time to emit. We're going to have to do a combination of both with the Boeing Company to be in alignment with the CCA of Washington State. That's all kind of like the prepared marks I have right now. Hopefully I didn't go too fast. I know it's kind of a complicated topic, but I think it's kind of fun because you get the chance to marry up market strategy of carbon allowances with capital investment for energy efficiency projects. So it's given our teams a good opportunity to collaborate and integrate together and tell a cohesive story about why we should implement some of these improvements.
Thanks so much, Ron. Spiro, do you have anything you'd like to add here at the end?
Yeah, if that's okay, just a minute or two. Ron just did a wonderful job presenting that. It is very complex, and I kind of giggled a little bit where he says, "Yeah, you can make a job out of this." Yeah, it's a job, all right. There's a lot of tracking going on, and especially being a global company like the Boeing company is, right? Well, the West Coast, of course, is going to be the toughest restrictions on the GHG, but we do have a couple points going for us, and I just want to maybe highlight some of it. Most of the power that we have in the city of Seattle is hydro, right? So it's already 99.8% green. So that's why we're really concentrating on the fossil fuel market, right? And how to reduce the fossil fuel market, because we're not going to get any large reduction credits from the electricity side, right? It's going to have to be on the fossil fuel commodity. So that's one point to remember. The second point that also to remember is you need to work with your finance person to expand your ROIs. As we continue these major capital infrastructures, CapEx going forward, the standard 5-year ROI is not going to work in these scenarios, and it's going to be paramount that if you're going to play in this arena, that you make that understood that this is playing the long game, not the short game. To recapture these investments. The other part that we're looking at too is we're kind of got the cart in front of the horse, and Ron really alluded to that. These restrictive credits are getting tougher and tougher to meet with each 3-year period. At the same time, we do have close partnerships with our utilities up here. I mean, very close. And how much capacity can we get? When can we get more transmission lines? When are you ready to pull the trigger on it? In the meantime, our government side of the house is saying, hey, by 2030 you got to be here, and it's like, can we be there? We don't have the capacity to be there. So we're looking at alternative methods also, which kind of drives up the pricing in the capital investment, like a dual feed boiler, the ability to switch from from natural gas to electric, and maybe back to natural gas in a time of crisis or curtailment or power outage. So please just keep that in mind for those of you on the team, that there's a whole lot more behind what Ron is showing here, just for the thinking process. So I didn't want to take up too much time. I want to leave it open for questions, but I hope that answers a few that you may have as we get into the Q&A period.
Thanks so much, Spiro. I think that is a very reasonable question to ask, is as we electrify, is there even capacity on our grid to be able to electrify at the rate that folks want us to? And working with the utilities to make sure that's there is definitely something that has to be done. So going into some of the questions that I've seen in the chat, the first question I have from Isaac, and Ron, I think you dove into this a little bit, but if we've already covered this, we can just answer it quickly.
Yeah, scope one, but it's primarily natural gas stuff, scope one.
Scope one, okay. And one question here from Melissa. Have you heard if you can get grants being in quotations, from the state of Washington to help fund electrification projects as it pertains to, as meeting your cap decrease?
Yeah, I can take that one, Ron. Yeah, you can. There are grants available. Unfortunately, because of our size, we don't qualify for it. So I think for the smaller businesses, there's a better chance of the grant being applied to you. But for us, I'll give you an example. Our Everett site's 18, 0.3 million square feet, huge site, and because of our corporation status, we really don't get the chance to apply for the grant. And I'm going to make a plug because we're going to have another show here on the EPCs. That's why we're using the energy performance contracts, kind of taking that into consideration as a grant because it's a shared savings and it's a smaller capital outlay in the beginning, a little longer term for the payback, but it's a shared guaranteed savings and it makes it a little easier on the cash flow. Um, I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Spiro. Um, and one question that we have here from Danny. Um, can you remind us what the cost of a ton of carbon is in the Washington market? If an efficiency project had an ROI of 5 years, are you able to say what the new ROI would be when you factor in the price of carbon?
Yeah, it jumped all around. This is the first year of the Washington State program. So it went up to a high around 71. This is a rough estimate early in the summer, down to a low 30s earlier this year. It's probably around somewhere, last I checked was a few weeks ago, probably around that like $45 a metric ton right now. Yeah, and that's what we tend to do. We probably overcomplicated it and do a whole chart of, because our no cost allowances step down over time, and so we really factor out long term. But the price of carbon kind of and directly relating to a ROI is probably the easier way to explain that sometimes. So we also do that, but it's we're kind of showing that carbon position, the cost over time, and marrying it up against the capital investment. So yeah.
Excellent. Does anyone else in the webinar have a question for Spiro or Ron? If so, please put it in the chat. I saw Melissa had a comment for the state of Washington. The ceiling and floor price by law will go up by 5% plus the inflation each year in Washington State. That's not something I knew, so I'm glad I learned something there, which would make sense. Does anyone have any other questions? Okay. Not seeing any other questions, I feel in the very privileged position to say thank you so much to Ron and Spiro for presenting all of this information. I know I certainly learned a lot. This wasn't a program that I was familiar with before starting this webinar. So thanks so much to Spiro and Ron for taking the time and out of their busy schedules and presenting this to us today. I really appreciate it. And thanks so much to everyone for attending. I feel very privileged to give you back about 15 minutes of your time. Have a wonderful and happy holiday, everyone, and a very safe and healthy new year. I will see you all soon. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank you.